On the day of my son Max's full moon banquet, my sister-in-law Susan, who is always stingy, gave me a big brand baby bottle. But I turned around and gave it to the super masculine baby next door. In my previous life, I took the baby bottle with joy and used it to feed Max day and night. But I never thought that a month later, Max had a heart attack late at night and died in my arms on the spot. Strangely, the day after my son died, my sister-in-law Susan's child Leo, who was frail and sick and was placed in the ICU for observation since birth, was discharged safely. After losing my child, I had a mental breakdown and cried all day long. My husband said that I was a nemesis, and not only did he want to divorce me, but also asked me to leave the house. After I refused, he and Susan accidentally beat me to death. After death, I learned that Susan was not my husband's biological sister, but was adopted by my mother-in-law as a child bride. They worked together to kill me. When I opened my eyes again, I returned to the day when Susan gave me the bottle. Sarah, when you just gave birth to Max, I was busy taking care of Leo in the hospital. I didn't have time to come to see you. As she said that, she took out a gift box from the bag behind her. Looking at the familiar scene in front of me, my breathing stagnated slightly. I was really reborn. In the last life, I took Susan's bottle and killed my son. I will never let the tragedy happen again in this life. Look, I just came out of the hospital today and hurried over. The small bottle I bought for our Max. Do you like it? I looked up and looked at Susan. Her eyes were bright and full of expectations. You bought an international brand, and now Leo's daily hospitalization costs so much. You said you are still spending money. I feel embarrassed to accept it. My pretended refusal made her a little anxious, and she held my hand tightly. Her voice also rose a lot. Sarah, look at what you are saying. I am an aunt. What's wrong with buying something for the child? Don't refuse. This is all Susan's heart. Just accept it. My husband suddenly broke into our conversation. Okay, since your brother said so, I won't be polite with you. Seeing me accept the milk bottle, Susan and my husband looked at each other. After the guests were much less, Susan came around again. Sarah, let me make some milk powder for Max. She quickly opened the box of the milk bottle. I nodded with a smile. Okay, then I'll trouble you. Looking at her back as she left happily, I breathed a sigh of relief. As early as after she gave me the milk bottle, I asked my best friend to pass it on to the neighbor next door. Her son is a super male, doing all kinds of evil in the community. Killing stray cats is fine, but she also tried to rape a little girl not long ago. But her mother is also an unreasonable and brutal person. Everyone in our community can only hide from them when they see them. The neighbor naturally accepted the milk bottle we offered to her. Although her son is an adult, his mind is only at the age of 5, and he usually drinks water with a milk bottle. The milk bottle that Susan took away just now was bought by me in advance. Come on, Sarah. I've made it. Hurry up and feed Max. I see the child is about to cry because of hunger. I followed her words and looked down at my son. The hand holding him was also tightening. Okay. Seeing me so obedient, Susan's eyes were filled with a dark light. My husband also came over at this time and naturally put his arm on Susan's shoulder. The two began to flirt in front of me. In the previous life, Susan often flirted with my husband under the guise of sister-in-law, although I felt strange in my heart. But think about it carefully, they are biological siblings. After all, what can happen? It's a pity that I never expected that they were a couple. And my child also made wedding clothes for the child they gave birth to. It was at this time in the previous life that Susan gave my son a gift. I was very happy at that time and cherished the milk bottle she gave me. I usually use the water and milk she gave to Max. But after a few days, I found something wrong with the child. The baby, who always loves to laugh and move, suddenly became quiet, and this quietness made me a little uneasy. Not only that, his lips were also a little purple. As a mother for the first time, I quickly discussed with my husband to go to the hospital to check the child's body. Unexpectedly, he directly refused. Wife, are you making a fuss? Don't be so sensitive. The doctor said our child was healthy. You will only feel worse if you are too nervous. Now, besides, is the hospital a good place? What if our son gets infected with another disease? After listening to my husband, I felt that what my husband said made sense, so I gave up the idea. But a month later, when I was feeding Max, his face suddenly turned purple, and before I could react, he closed his eyes forever. I was terrified and rushed him to the hospital. I held him all the way and felt his body temperature drop, but I could do nothing. When we arrived at the hospital, the doctor directly pronounced my child dead. Your child's heart is half the size of that of children of the same age. As a parent, don't you know? It is because of your negligence that the child is now in such a bad condition. When I heard these words, I was shocked. Later, Brian took me back, and we didn't say a word that night. I was immersed in the pain of losing my child and didn't realize my husband's abnormality at all. The next day, Susan brought Leo to my house, and she was in high spirits and sprinkled salt on my wounds. My family Leo's heart disease has been cured, and he finally doesn't have to go to the hospital anymore. As soon as the voice fell, I immediately quarreled with her. Unexpectedly, my husband pushed me to the ground with his backhand. Who do you think you are? How dare you talk to Susan like this? You are a fucking evil star. Not only did you kill the child, but you are still here with a sense of righteousness? Divorce. Hurry up and get out of here with the child. I disagreed, stood up and slapped him. During the quarrel, I was knocked unconscious by Susan holding a chair. After death, I realized that they were a real family. Susan has always been the child bride that my mother-in-law found for my husband, and my son and I became their wedding clothes. Thinking of this, I couldn't control the hatred in my heart anymore. Sarah, Susan's voice suddenly pulled me back from my thoughts, and I stared at her blankly. Unexpectedly, she pointed at the bottle in my hand awkwardly. Sarah, Max has finished his milk. I called you for a long time just now, but you didn't respond. What are you thinking? I quickly took the bottle away and smiled awkwardly. Nothing. After Susan left in the evening, Brian followed closely. I'll go see my sister off. I nodded, afraid that sending her home was fake, and the two of us going to the hospital to have sex was real. But I don't care about these. In this world, I only have one relative. That is Max in my arms. And now what I have to do is to find evidence of Brian's cheating and make him leave the house. Brian was gone for a whole night, and he came back in the morning when I was half asleep. He smelled strongly of hospital medicine and seemed to be in a good mood. Is Leo better? I approached with concern, and Brian raised his eyebrows. He will be well soon, at most in a month. While speaking, his eyes unconsciously fell on my son. You have to take good care of Max too. He's prone to catching colds recently, so you should pay more attention. I snorted coldly and didn't answer. At this critical moment, he certainly wanted my son to be safe. After all, only if my son is in good health can he and Susan's Max survive. He took off his coat tiredly. I'll sleep for a while now, and I have to go to the company later. After speaking, he walked straight to the bedroom, but before he touched the door handle, his cell phone rang. Brian, come to the hospital quickly. Leo is not right. As soon as these words came out, Brian became visibly nervous. I stood next to him and naturally heard the content of the call. Okay, I'll be there right away. Seeing that he was about to leave, I hurriedly called him. Was that Susan's call just now? Did something happen to the child? Brian perfunctorily said to me while putting on his clothes. Yes, don't ask so many questions. I'll go to the hospital first. I'll go with you. Hearing this, Brian's body froze in place, but he soon reacted and pointed to Max beside him. Who will take care of Max if you leave? Before he finished speaking, the bedroom door beside him was pushed open. I'm here. Vivian? Brian's face looked a little ugly, and he leaned close to me and asked in a low voice, when will she come? I laughed dryly. Vivian likes Max, so I asked her to stay with me and take care of him for a few days. In this situation, Brian could only take me to the hospital. When we arrived at the hospital, Susan threw herself into Brian's arms first. Brother, I'm scared. The moment she saw me, she hugged my husband tightly again. Her eyes kept challenging me. Sarah, you're here too? I ignored her little movements and walked straight to the bed. Just now you said on the phone that Leo was in trouble. What happened to the child? At this time, Susan seemed to react and picked up the child with tears in her eyes. When I was feeding the child just now, I didn't hold the bowl steady, and it fell to the ground. The glass fragments just pierced Leo's face. She touched the bandaged wound of the child with heartache. Then I suddenly found that the child would not cry. I asked him if it hurt, and he shook his head and said it didn't hurt. Listening to her description, I understood. Keoxeon has another advantage. That is, his perception of pain is much weaker than that of ordinary people. Obviously, the bottle Susan gave has worked. The child really said it doesn't hurt? Brian stood aside, and the worry in his eyes was about to overflow. Susan shook her head hurriedly. The child is fine. I just feel weird. While speaking, she unceremoniously took my husband's arm. Brother, I'm just afraid. I'm afraid something will happen to my son. I smiled and said, isn't Leo sleeping soundly now? Don't worry, Sarah. Of course you are not in a hurry if it's not your child, Susan replied angrily after hearing what I said. But I didn't get angry. I just gently touched the child's hair. We are all family. I feel sorry for anyone's child. Besides, Leo looks so much like your brother. I like him too. After saying that, the ward suddenly became quiet, and the atmosphere became a little weird. After a long time, Brian stuttered and spoke. After all, I am the child's uncle, so it's normal that he looks more like me. I nodded. I just don't know who the child's biological father is. Susan, I haven't heard you mention the child's father either. Susan's face turned pale, and she felt a little helpless. Brian saw that the situation was not right, and hurriedly pulled me away. On the way back, his face was tense. Wife, don't ask about Susan's husband in the future. Why? After a long time, Brian finally said a word. That's Susan's privacy. It's better for us not to ask. I didn't say anything, but I felt extremely sarcastic in my heart. As soon as I arrived at the community, I saw that super handsome child, who was running around with a slingshot at that time. When he saw someone coming, he threw stones at others. I stood in the distance and watched for a long time, and I was more looking forward to the changes that Leo would have. A week later, Susan suddenly knocked on my door with a beaming smile. I was not surprised to see her again. The only difference was that she was holding Leo by her side. I widened my eyes, very surprised. Did the doctor allow Leo to come out for his illness? Leo was a premature baby, and his organs were not fully developed when he was born, so he was transferred to the ICU as soon as he came out. He came out only after he was fine. He just fainted in the 3rd grade of elementary school when he suddenly fainted in a physical education class and was rushed to the hospital. The doctor said that the child had a heart problem and had more than 3 months to live. That day, Susan hugged my husband and cried for a long time. I felt sorry for her, so I promised to help her pay for the medical expenses. Not only that, I also asked my other partners to help find a doctor who could treat the disease. I was just on guard day and night, but I didn't expect Susan to focus on my son's heart. When she saw me asking, Susan put the hair in front of her face, behind her ears, a little embarrassedly. Yes, the doctor said Leo's heart suddenly got better. Sarah, do you think this is strange? I shook my head. It's a good thing that the child can be discharged from the hospital. As I was talking, I welcomed the two of them in, and my eyes unconsciously fell on Leo. Susan was immersed in the joy of her son's heart being better, and she didn't realize that her son was different. Sarah, where is Max? Is he okay? When I heard her ask Max, my heart skipped a beat. Then I shook my head sadly. I don't know what's wrong with Max recently, and he doesn't eat well. He always likes to sleep, and I'm going to take him to the hospital. After saying that, I sighed heavily. Susan was so happy that she smiled like a flower. Sarah, what hospital are you going to? Newborns are like this. You still don't understand. Don't make a fuss. It's not good for the child to go to the hospital all the time. I nodded perfunctorily. You're right. I'm just a little fussy. During the conversation, Susan suddenly realized that Leo was missing. Where did Leo go? Sarah, did you see it? My eyes fell on the open door behind her, and I already knew the reason. Did he go out? As soon as I said that, I heard a scream from the other side. Where the hell did you come from, you wild kid? How dare you run into my house and act wild? I can't fucking kill you. Susan's face was a little ugly, and she hurriedly looked for the sound. I followed closely and found that Leo and that super bear baby were fighting. Leo was only a few years old, and was pressed to the ground by Chao Zhang, and one of his legs was twisted into an arc. Susan screamed and pushed Kaoxiang away, hugging her child distressingly. Leo's face was covered in blood, and his body was covered with Kaoxiang's teeth marks, but he just couldn't feel the pain. The neighbor walked towards Susan aggressively. Are you the mother of this child? Will you discipline your son? Look at how my son is bullied. You must pay. Seeing that the other party was blaming her, Susan's anger could no longer be suppressed. I'm going to call the police. But the next second, her voice was much weaker. Then she rolled and crawled to the woman's feet and took the bottle from her hand while the woman was not paying attention. Her voice was trembling. Where did you get this bottle? She turned her head and looked at me again, her eyes full of resentment and tears. Didn't I give this bottle to Max? Being stared at by her fierce eyes, I couldn't help but feel a little irritated. Just as she was about to speak, the neighbor snatched the bottle from Susan. Fuck you. What did you buy? This is my son's. What does it have to do with you? When she said this, the neighbor looked at me warily. After all, she was afraid that I would take the bottle back. Seeing this, I quickly helped Susan up from the ground. Let's go. This family is not easy to mess with. The bottle you bought for me is at home. It belongs to someone else. My words were consistent with what the neighbor said just now, and it completely dispelled Susan's suspicion. She half supported herself to stand up, but before she could stand firmly, she turned her head and found that Leo had fainted. Leo. Sarah. Call my brother quickly. Hurry. I couldn't help sneering in my heart, but I still did it. In this kind of situation, any normal person would know to call an ambulance quickly, but Susan did the opposite. But it doesn't matter after all, it's not my child. It was half an hour later when Brian arrived. During this time, Susan did nothing but cry while holding the child. But fortunately, except for the leg, Leo had no other major wounds. What are you doing? Are you sick? Why are you standing there stupidly if you don't send the child to the hospital? Brian quickly took the child from Susan's arms and sent him to the car. His face was a little solemn, his eyebrows were furrowed, and the atmosphere was a little awkward. Susan choked and said, I also want to wait for you to come, and we will. Okay, shut up. Get in the car. Brian interrupted her next words impatiently, and while the two of them were in a stalemate, I quickly squeezed into the car. Hurry to the hospital. I'll go with you, so you can take care of it. My son has Vivian. I finished talking to myself, and Brian had no choice but to shut up. After arriving at the hospital, Leo was sent directly to the operating room. Susan looked at the door of the operating room with an annoyed look, and Brian kept circling the door. Both of them showed a kind of anxiety on their faces. I don't know how long it took before the doctor came out. He looked at the two of them with some reproach. You are the parents of the child, right? Brian didn't come back, but looked back at me. Instead, Susan admitted directly and shamelessly, yes, how is my son now? The leg is in plaster, and the small wound is also bandaged. But I found that the child seemed to be unable to feel pain, and there was no reaction at all during the whole process. The doctor took off his glasses. Wait a few days. I suggest you give the child a full body check. Brian nodded, and then followed the doctor to the department to listen to some precautions. After he left, Susan twisted her waist and walked in front of me. She said in a delicate voice, Sarah, I said, we are a family just now in a hurry. You won't be angry, right? When she said this, her whole face wanted to stick close to me. I smiled with curved lips. How could it be? You and your brother are a family. Okay, I'll go to the bathroom now. You wait here. After saying that, I got up and left without caring about her obstruction. Today I had to come to the hospital with you. In fact, there is another purpose. To get my son's physical examination report. After rebirth, I have been paying attention to my son's growth. He eats white and fat every day, but I still have a shadow in my heart. When Brian went to the company a few days ago, I quickly made an appointment for a full physical examination of children online. This is the best hospital in the city, and it is also the hospital where Leo is. In order to prevent them from finding out, I finally let Vivian take the child there. When I saw that all the items on the report were normal, the stone in my heart finally fell. Fortunately, I protected my son well in this life. When we came out of the hospital, Brian was still reluctant to leave. I understand him. After all, his son is still lying in the operating room, and he can't stay to accompany him now. At the same time, I don't understand him. Leo and Max are both his sons. Why is he so cruel to use my child's life in exchange for his other child's life? I simply stopped thinking about it because I couldn't figure it out. Soon, the car stopped at the bottom of the residential building. Looking at the dilapidated residential house, I couldn't help but sneer in my heart. I was really sick in my head to agree to stay here for confinement instead of going to my big villa. When I was about to give birth in my previous life, Brian told me worriedly, our house is so big, I don't think it's suitable to raise a child. My family has an old house with a strong human touch. The child will definitely be healthier if he lives in such a popular environment. I believed it. After becoming a mother, I am willing to try anything for the good of the child. So I agreed. But I never expected that Susan would move in right after I moved out of the villa. And the house I bought became the place for their affair. What's even funnier is that the human touch Brian mentioned was actually because there was a super masculine baby and her domineering mother living next door. But it doesn't matter anymore. I calculated the day and it will be soon. Wife, I have something to tell you. Brian hesitated. I looked at him curiously. What is it? I am not the one managing the company now. But I have no real power, and many old employees don't listen to me. If this goes on, I won't be able to manage the company. How about, okay, I got it. I'll go to the company in person tomorrow. After the words fell, the greed in Brian's eyes could not be concealed. He grabbed my hand excitedly. Really? Wife? You are so good to me. Don't worry. I will treat you and our son well. I pulled my hand out calmly and got out of the car. Let's talk about tomorrow's matter tomorrow. When I was about to go upstairs, Brian suddenly called me. A trace of embarrassment appeared on his face, and then he shook his phone at me. Wife, Susan just sent me a message saying Leo woke up. I need to go and see. You know, Susan only has me as her family. I smiled. Then go quickly. They need you right now. While speaking, I turned on my phone and sent a message to my assistant in the company. Online meeting in 5 minutes. I was originally thinking about how to get Brian out of the way, but now it seems that there is no need at all. After going upstairs, I hurried to disinfect. After all, I went to the hospital and I don't know how many viruses I brought with me. After changing clothes, I went in to see my son again, and then quickly turned on the computer. You can report now. Since my rebirth, Brian is the one who manages the company on the surface, but in fact, I have been involved in the company's affairs every day. As for his employees who don't listen to him, it's because he wants to transfer shares to himself in my name. What happened in the company, as long as I want to know, I can know. In my previous life, I devoted all my heart and soul to taking care of my children, and I handed over all the company's affairs to Brian. Actually, my assistant reminded me at that time, it seems that Mr. Shen is not wholeheartedly for the company. All the contracts he signed before have lost money. I didn't take it seriously at that time. It's okay, just let him exercise. Now that I think about it, there is nothing else except that I think I am stupid. Have you finished reporting? The public relations department will prepare in a few days, and then any news about me will be on the hot search. Spend money to get on the hot search. Okay, after the meeting, I hurried to hug my son again, and he slept soundly. Vivian always laughed at me for being too nervous about my son, but I didn't know how to explain it to her. In fact, she also advised me in the last life, how many rich girls married poor boys, how many of them had a good result. Are you mentally ill? You have a villa, but don't live in this small building? Are you married to Brian or his sister? Thinking of this, I looked at Vivian and smiled foolishly. Vivian, thank you. Her old face turned red and she rolled her eyes at me. You have to buy me a bag, even if you say nice things. You owe me this. Okay, I'll buy it for you. There was no news for 3 days after Brian left. During this period, I didn't call him once. Until this day, he came home in a state of depression, and the sadness on his face could not be concealed. What's wrong? Didn't you ask me to go to the company? I couldn't contact you for several days. I asked a few questions with concern, but I didn't expect Brian to break down and cry. Something happened to Leo. I was a little impatient. What happened again? He took a deep breath. The doctor said it was super male. But it shouldn't be. That disease is in the mother's womb. How could Leo suddenly appear? Then, his eyes swept across my face. I haven't asked you yet. How is Max recently? I couldn't help but feel a little panicked when I mentioned my son. Max is not doing well recently. He always falls into a coma, and he won't drink milk every time I feed him. His lips are often purple, and his breathing is much slower. I want to take him to the hospital. No, Brian spoke subconsciously, and soon he realized that there was a loophole in what he said. He quickly tried to make up for himself. What I mean is that the child is still young. Don't go to the hospital all the time. The hospital is not a good place. They will tell you that you are sick even if you are not sick. Okay, I will listen to you. After saying this, Brian leaned back on the sofa with some ease. Strange. What's going on with Leo? He closed his eyes and kept muttering. Seeing him like this, I was a little angry and immediately called my assistant. It can be released. Let the public relations department go on the hot search. I want to see this news on the front page in half an hour. My company has always been very efficient, I know this. Looking at Brian, who was in deep sleep on the sofa, I slapped him to wake him up without any courtesy. He looked at me angrily and yelled at me. What the hell are you doing? I slapped him again and threw the phone at him. You still have the nerve to say that? Brian saw that my face was a little wrong and felt embarrassed. He picked up the phone and looked at it. I sneered. Brian, you live a very cool life every day. Wife, listen to my explanation. I don't know where this photo came from. I crossed my arms. You don't know? It's on the hot search now, and the company's stock has been falling. Tell me, Brian, what should we do now? Brian's face turned pale, and he looked at me helplessly. What should I do? What should I do? Sorry, honey, I really don't know. I picked up the phone slowly. The back in the photo is Susan, right? Yes, it's Susan. These unscrupulous media are completely writing nonsense. Honey, my whole heart belongs to you. Don't believe these. He was sweating profusely, and he wanted to kneel down to explain to me. I smiled at him. Husband, I know you and Susan are a family, of course I know. But these media don't believe it, and there are other directors in the company. Now the stock is still falling. I have to give them an explanation. Brian is almost being led by the nose by me now. Then, what should I do now? His lips trembled, and his eyes were full of confusion. I immediately took out the responsibility transfer form that I had prepared long ago. Sign it. I will take responsibility for you. Brian looked at the big words on it and turned to the signature page without thinking. Okay, wife, you are so good to me. Looking at the 3 names scribbled on it, I could hardly hold back my laughter. With this, the board of directors won't bother you anymore. But you must not go to the company these days. They are not easy to mess with. Brian nodded very obediently. Okay. Just as he calmed down, Susan called again. This time, he shouted impatiently to the other side. I just got home. What's wrong again? The crying voice on the other side soon came from the receiver. Leo has respiratory failure. He was sent to the hospital. Hearing this, Brian did not hesitate for a moment and rushed out in a hurry. I followed him, and the usually lively next door was now silent. I think it was the relapse of Chaozhong's disease. In order to avoid conflicts with neighbors, I would share good things with them. After a while, neighbors began to complain to me. You all say that I spoil this child too much. Yes, I spoil my son. That's because the doctor said my son won't live past 25. I went back to the house and faxed the contract to my assistant. On the surface, it is a responsibility transfer contract, but in fact it is a voluntary divorce agreement, and it is the kind of leaving the house with nothing. It's really good to have money, and soon the divorce certificate was in my hands. And Vivian also sent me a message. The house is bought. I have found a buyer for the original villa. Now the newly bought villa can be moved in directly. In the evening, the police called me. Brian said very dejectedly, Wife, Susan is dead. I was a little shocked and rushed to the police station quickly. When we got there, we found out that when Leo was sent to the operating room, Susan went to buy some daily necessities for him. She happened to meet a neighbor who was buying food. She came out to make milk powder for her son with a bottle, and this time Susan finally realized something was wrong. She snatched the bottle from the neighbor. Why is this bottle on you? I took it to exchange my son's life. As soon as she said this, the neighbor pressed her to the ground. Exchange life? You took my son's life to exchange for your son's. Do you want to die? No wonder my son is in the hospital now. The neighbor was very excited and picked up the restaurant's kitchen knife and chopped at Susan. With one knife, she just cut her aorta. Susan died on the spot. At the same time, the bottle was broken, and Leo died of a heart attack in the operating room. The neighbor was also arrested. Brian looked at me pitifully, and his hand unconsciously pulled up. Wife, I only have you from now on. I sneered. Don't yell. I'm not your wife. He looked puzzled. What did you say? I took out the divorce certificate slowly. Look carefully what this is. The reason I came to the police station is to expose you. As I said, I took out a stack of contracts. Comrade police, I want to call the police. These are all evidence that Brian embezzled company funds. Brian sat on the ground with a dead face. You why? Why? Brian, if I don't do something, my son's life will be exchanged for Leo by you and Susan, right? His face was blue and purple. You know everything. I raised my eyebrows. Yes. The evidence was conclusive, and Brian was locked up on the spot. I came out of the police station and went straight back to the newly bought villa. Max was sleeping soundly, and Vivian looked at me with a smile. You finally decided to divorce. I nodded. Of course I want to divorce. Looking at Max and his friends in front of me, the haze I had experienced before was swept away.